Mr. Chairman, welcome back to the program. Let's get right to it here. One of the most interesting parts of this report, I think, is you guys said as the U.S. withdrew troops in 2021, it did not simultaneously withdraw diplomats and their families, which left them exposed there. That was the so-called fatal flaw in President Biden's plan to leave Afghanistan, is what the report concludes.
Correct. Yeah. No, Jason, that's absolutely correct. It seemed to me, and even that summer, getting the briefings, that the military and the intelligence community were in a totally different reality from the White House and State Department. The military had their orders to retrograde by July, and State Department really saw an evacuation as a failure, and so therefore had rose-colored lenses, if you will, not really seeing the real threat on the ground as it existed. And that's what we call willful blindness. I mean, it's willful blindness to not want to see what's reality. It was very clear what was happening. The State Department is charged by federal law, by Congress, to initiate an evacuation plan. It's called the NEO. They continue to refuse to implement a plan until the day the Taliban actually overran Kabul. By that time, it was too late. And that is why you saw the chaos ensue. The ambassador, Wilson, who's tasked primarily with that, fled to the airport, leaving all of his personnel behind, including the Afghans. Thousands of classified documents, thousands of passports were destroyed. And then we saw the worst day, and that was the suicide bombing, killing 13 servicemen, women, killing 170 Afghans, injuring 45 American personnel and Afghan. And then the worst thing, Jason, I'll finish, is they put the Taliban in charge. The Taliban were put in charge of screening both American citizens and Afghans, screening travel documents, passports, visas. They were the final arbiter as to who got in and who got out. It was a nightmare of a day. We knew the suicide bomber, the threat was imminent. We actually knew the timing. It was reported by the snipers, and permission was not given to engage. And now we saw the result. This all could have been avoided if we just had a plan. You know, they say when you fail to plan, you plan to fail. This was a failure of epic proportions.
Why was the State Department and the Department of Defense so far apart on this? You would think that as the number of troops go down, the number of Americans there would fall as well, but that didn't happen. Why not? What happened here?
Well, they're in different worlds. In fact, from the minute President Biden decided what they call go to zero, that means all military personnel, that means all contractors, that means all air power, it leaves Afghanistan. When that happens, the Afghan military didn't have a chance. And this is why General McKenzie, CENTCOM commander, General Milley, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Miller on the ground, the IC, all advised against going to zero. What they did advise was what the prior administration had done, and that was to keep 2,500 troops, a light footprint, with 6,500 NATO and air cover to stabilize Afghanistan from what happened, including Bagram Air Base, which we all know, $7 billion in military equipment, cash, and worst of all, Jason, thousands of ISIS-K, got out of those prisons, 8 of whom are detained in the United States, having gotten through the southwest border.
The Department of Defense and the State Department both had, after action reports on what happened there. Well, what did you find in those? And were those not sufficient enough to prevent this from ever happening again?
Well, that's the whole point of the exercise, Jason. I'm not trying to score political points, even though I'm being accused of that today. I want to get to the truth, like a federal prosecutor would. I didn't make arbitrary conclusions. I weighed the facts, evidence, came to an investigation that's leading up, to the top. But the bottom line here and goal is to make sure this never happens again. We had Saigon, we had Kabul, we had an office to deal with this that the Biden administration shut down prior to the Taliban takeover. So we want to legislate an emergency evacuation plan that everybody knows who's in charge, because nobody knew who was in charge at the time. The military had a very different objective than the White House and state. State had the optics of politics, the optics of everything's fine, it's going to plan. Sure. You're not going to see helicopters like Saigon, and we know it just didn't end up that way.
But as far as what's already been out there, this happened, 3 years ago now, was the existing reports, were they not sufficient enough to show this country, the plan away from this so it doesn't happen again?
And thank you for bringing that up. So it took me not only a subpoena, but a motion to compel the after action report and the dissent cable that was filed by 24 State Department employees at the embassy. This is an extraordinary exercise. In fact, historically, it's never been done. This is a channel that goes to the secretary in the event of a crisis. These 24 employees were in fear of their lives because they saw the Taliban overrunning Kabul, coming towards the embassy. They sent a lifeline up to the White House for help, and they were essentially discarded by Ambassador Wilson, who left them behind. So we have to take, and their testimonies, Jason, are very extensively quoted in my report. Now, I wouldn't have had that if I hadn't threatened a subpoena and a motion to compel. But having said that, it gives us great insight as to what was happening on the ground, both from the diplomatic standpoint and also the military.
Despite several years of investigation, despite the DOD report, the State Department after action report, your 354-page report that's out right now too, you said there are still unanswered questions. What are they?
Well, all roads lead to the National Security Council. And, I'm not finished with this investigation. It's not about the election. It's going to happen after. All roads lead to the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who is in charge of the National Security Council. We have found through all of our testimonies in this report that all of these communications found their way to the nerve center, if you will, the National Security Council, and then ultimately within the White House itself. Now, I know executive privilege will be asserted, but we intend to follow those leads as high as we can, as far as we can, because accountability is important here. I was with the Gold Star families last night, and they said, not one person has been held accountable. In our recommendations, we hold those individuals accountable through a resolution by Congress. But almost every one of those officials have been promoted since the evacuation.
You said this is not about politics, but why release it now, just 2 months before the election?
Yeah, and I get asked that a lot. This was not my timing. I didn't choose this by design. The timing is a result of not being able to get documents, witness testimony, having to serve subpoenas. It took me 8 months to get Jen Psaki to testify. Secretary Blinken is still refusing to testify, even though I've served a subpoena and I will threaten him with contempt. They have stonewalled this investigation in the hopes that it would go after the election, so they wouldn't have to deal with this. What they didn't know is that I had enough already to publish a report, but I would have preferred to have, delivered this a year ago. I didn't have the evidence.
Secretary Blinken's supposed to testify before your committee next Thursday, the 19th of September. Do you expect he is going to? And if so, what do you want to know from him specifically?
Look, I've got respect for, him, But I'll tell you, when I talked to him on the phone, he said he didn't have one day in the entire month of September to come before Congress to tell the American people what happened and answer to this report. The Gold Star families deserve this. The American people deserve this. And I want to know, what is your response to my report? What can you do working with me to fix this problem? But he says, I don't have one day available. I don't think people buy that. I think he's looking for cover. I told him he had left me no other choice but to serve a subpoena on him, and if necessary, move to compel his testimony. If I do that, he'll be the first Secretary of State to have ever been held in contempt. And I don't think he wants that outcome.
Two last questions for you here, Mr. Chairman. What do you want Texans to take away from this? Because we all watched what happened 3 years ago, and a lot of people think they know the story. What's the message for Texans here?
The message I have is what I've said all along. Afghanistan, it's not far from home. I mean, we say it's halfway around the world. But what has happened since the fall of Afghanistan? Our adversaries have seen a leader projecting weakness, not strength, inviting conflict, aggression, and war. Months after Afghanistan fell, we saw Putin and the Russian Federation invading Ukraine. We saw Putin's ally, Chairman Xi, now threatening Taiwan and the Pacific. We've also seen recent events, the Ayatollah, who is an ally of Putin and Xi, rear his ugly head with Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi rebels threatening Israel. They're all tied together. To bring home to Texas, thousands of ISIS prisoners let out of Bagram prisons, now in the Khorasan region, which is a dangerous external operation territory, have now found their way to get into Mexico, up through our southwest border and into the United States. 8 are under detention by the FBI. Others had a smuggling ring of 400 people. We don't know what we don't know. How many more have been allowed to come in? And it's all a result of a failed policy with respect to Afghanistan, which then led to a failed foreign policy that is making the world very dangerous right now for the United States.
Last question here. Mr. Chairman, you said you hope this leads to legislative and policy solutions. Is there a piece of legislation, a bill that you would present or you think is going to come out of this that would prevent such a disaster from ever happening again?
Absolutely. I mean, number one, you can't have this bifurcation of military and state. You know, they need to be integrated. Diplomatic Security Corps needs to be reporting straight to the Secretary of State. We need a legislation that provides direct guidance as to who's in charge, what needs to be done, when the plan needs to be executed. All those things were missing. There was no plan, and that's why you saw what you saw was an utter disaster on the ground that resulted in loss of life that didn't really have to happen. I talked to the Secretary about this very extensively, and I think this is one area of good faith where I do think I can work with him to try to come up with legislation to ensure this never happens again.
And is that legislation you intend or hope to introduce this Congress or what?
Yes. We don't have time. You know how many embassies are under threat around the world? Right. And I don't have time to go into this. This could happen again, not on this scale maybe, but we need to fix the problem.
Mr. Chairman, always appreciate the time. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Jason.